My name is Virginia Sharp, and I'm the Associate Provost for Faculty Development in the Office of Academic Affairs, and I'm also a Professor of History here at the University of New Mexico. And I will be serving as moderator for our session today, Moving Forward, a conversation about police force, justice, and community. We want to welcome all of you here for this conversation today. This discussion will offer multiple perspectives on Albuquerque's long-standing conflicts over police use of excessive force in an era of increased militarization of American culture, widespread availability of weapons, and rapid communications technology. The 5 participants are drawn from the fields of law enforcement, police-community relations, mental health, criminology, and the peace and justice community. And I apologize for the level of noise around here. This is a very, busy time here at UNM, and this is a public space that is being used today by school children and Earth Day booths and all that other sort of thing. So I'm hoping we'll be able to be heard. Can you hear me okay? The 5 participants are drawn from the fields of law enforcement, police community relations, mental health, criminology, and the peace and justice community, as well as journalism. They'll all have the opportunity to respond to questions posed by me. And the audience also at the end, we are asking people to give us very concise responses because we want to make sure that the audience will have an opportunity to ask questions. We believe that universities should be places where respect, wisdom, and good ideas emerge, even in the midst of profound crises of trust and legitimacy such as the city of Albuquerque is facing today. And we envision this event as an imperfect beginning or attempt to establish a conversation. As a stakeholder in our community, UNM is hosting this discussion in an effort to find common ground amid diverse and often deeply conflicting views. We only have an hour. This is just enough time to raise some questions and open dialogue, and we really hope everyone can learn something new and that we can move forward as a community. We are asking that panelists keep their responses concise, and I'm sorry to say, with an hour and five of you, that's going to mean something like under 3 minutes for responses to the questions. We'll ask audience members to do the same. And we certainly know that there are many of you who are here because you have suffered a personal loss. And we want you to know that we respect your pain. And I want to take a moment here just to have a moment amid all this noise. If we down here can observe just a moment of silence in honor of those losses. It's important at a moment like this to commit to listening, and even to listen to those with whom we disagree most vehemently. If you want to ask a question after the panelists have asked their questions, or after I've asked the questions that they submitted to me, please come to the microphone and ask your question. We see this forum as an attempt to model a respectful dialogue that addresses a complex and very difficult set of issues from multiple perspectives. And now I want to introduce the panelists in alphabetical order. Please note that none of these panelists is an official representative of any group or institution. Rather, we have asked them to participate based on their experience with problems related to the current crisis of trust and legitimacy. Vicente Alvarado, over here to my far right, is retired from the Albuquerque Police Department after 20 years of service. He was recognized as Detective of the Year in 2009 and served as Defensive Tactics Instructor, Ground Control Instructor, and he's certified in dignitary protection. He has testified as an expert witness in front of the New Mexico Department of Public Safety in regard to the use of force, although he does not have knowledge of particular incidents of the use of force. He has written and certified courses through NMDPS and currently instructs officers and the general public in self-defense. Caroline Bonham, who is 2 seats to the right of me, is a psychiatrist and the director of the UNM Department of Psychiatry Center for Rural and Community Behavioral Health. CRCBH seeks to address health disparities through increasing access to clinical care, workforce development, and community-partnered health services research. David Correa, to my immediate right here, is an assistant professor of American Studies. He writes about law, property, and violence, and we invited him to participate because he had written numerous articles on the history and development of the current controversy, and he's also been active in the peace and justice community. Karen Fisher, retired, and she's over there, fourth chair over there, retired from the Albuquerque Police Department in 2012 after 25 years of service as a civilian manager. During her career, Karen worked on developing and implementing programs that dealt with community engagement and using technology to assist public-private partnerships to address community public safety issues. And Maria B. Velez is an assistant professor with the Department of Sociology at UNM. Her work focuses on understanding how racial and economic inequalities pattern urban crime at the individual, neighborhood, and city levels. A relevant theme in her current research is studying how favorable city political contexts, because they can empower rather than marginalize residents, can set in motion processes that bolster the ability of neighborhoods, especially those marginalized by race, class, or nativity, to resolve community problems like public safety. And so I want to begin with a question that was posed by David Correa, or submitted by David Correa. Efforts to reform the Albuquerque Police Department are not new. Similar efforts occurred in 1997 when APD killed 31 people over a 10-year period. Those reform efforts, which included the creation of the Police Oversight Commission, were followed by a 6-year period ending in 2003 in which APD killed 22 people. Now we find ourselves once again confronting the problem of police violence in Albuquerque, and the Department of Justice has issued, I'm adding here to David's question, noting that the Department of Justice has issued a report finding widespread excessive use of force. What explains the failure of every reform effort to resolve the problem of APD violence in the last decades? And I think we'll start over on the right with Vicente Alvarado.
Thank you. Now, again, my comments are coming from experience in what the department teaches, why they teach it, why they don't teach certain things. So that's my area of expertise is. Now, as far as situations where people are being killed during incidents, the police department doesn't go out, and again, I'm not talking from any particular situation that's taking place. Reforming the Albuquerque Police Department is not going to stop violence in our community. Violence in our community is a community problem. It affects everybody throughout the community. The police are called to handle those situations. Now, when an officer gets there on scene, they can only respond to an action. The police department is always in a reactionary state. So when a subject acts a certain way, if they don't do what the officers are asking them to do, then the officer has to respond to certain things like that. In cases where there's violence, the officer has to respond to that violence. And 100% of the time, or I'd have to say maybe 95 to 98% of the time, the officers are in a reactionary mode. They have to respond and react to a subject's actions, which is basically putting them behind the curveball or behind the 8-ball right off the bat. So officers are having to respond to actions in a reactive state. So anytime somebody gets violent, the officer has to respond to that. They're taught to utilize the least amount of force necessary to effect an arrest or to stop an action. Now, sometimes that use of force may be a little more than what should have been done, and again, that's unexcusable. You know, officers are taught to have the highest regard of integrity and to just utilize the least amount necessary. Are there officers that use a little more? Sure, just like in any situation or in any...
I'm going to have to, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to move things along because time flies when you're talking. So actually I would ask if Maria could give us a perspective from the criminological point of view.
So what I would say is, stepping away from the issue and looking at it in a more broader context, we would look to the organizational features of the police department in particular, less so about the individuals, but looking at how organizations are patterned, right? Police departments vary in terms of organizational features. One important one would be, I would encourage there to be a serious conversation about having a civilian review board that promotes accountability between the residents and the police department, and this happens in other cities more effectively, is what I would say. And I also think one more thing the research is pretty clear about is that these kinds of organizational features that take place, sorry, it's hard to stay loud, that the way that these come about is by having mayors, for instance, and city council people pushing for these kinds of reforms. And again, what we see across the board is that there are some cities that are better poised to do those kinds of things, right? Because they have minority elected officials who push for these kinds of things, or you have a black mayor who pushes for these kinds of things, right? So I think organizationally is how we would look at it. Thank you.
Karen, would you like to contribute?
Sure. I think when we speak of reform and you're looking at something like the DOJ report, and you speak of 22 years, what hasn't changed for this community? What we're looking at is a report that criticizes one agency. Yes, the police department may have done something wrong, but these are people who are coming from Washington, D.C. into Albuquerque, looking at one aspect of our community. To be able to move this community forward, we can't just say this is the Albuquerque Police Department's problem, how do we reform them? What we need to do as a community is come together. We don't want violence. We don't want officers attacked. We don't want citizens attacked. And we cannot just blame the police department. Every single issue has underlying conditions that impact how people react. Where's the responsibility for you who live in your neighborhoods? How do you ante up to the table so you have the people at city government, so you have APD responding to the questions from the DOJ, but we can't do that as individuals. We can be part of a community conversation, but we have to define for ourselves on a day-to-day basis how we can make our community safer. Otherwise, in 10 years, we're going to be having the same question of how do we reform the Albuquerque Police Department. It's not a police problem, it's a community problem. We're all here together, all live and die in this city, and I hope that we can work together.
Caroline, would you like to respond?
I think it's important that the reforms need to take context in the larger base. I want to point out that the reform for the police department needs to take context in the larger context of the state. And so we have a state where we have a very drastically underfunded public mental health and substance use treatment system. So I know a lot of the incidents have taken place with people who may have had mental health problems. And first I want to be clear that people with mental health problems are much more likely to be a victim of violence than to perpetrate violence. But we often don't talk about the issue of substance use. And substance use does increase the risk of violence. As a healthcare system, I think we do not do a good job of proactively screening for people with substance use issues and offering treatment. And so substance use is very treatable, but as a healthcare system, we need to do a better job of screening people, asking if they have problems with substance use, and getting them into treatment. And I think those sort of things will help to reduce the risk of underlying violence in our communities.
David, would you like to respond to these answers?
Yeah, thank you. So I asked that question because if there's one thing that we've learned, and we didn't need the DOJ to tell us, is that we have a problem with police violence in this city. It's unique to this city in the sense that we kill more people, the police, kill more people at an absolute number and at a higher rate than any other police department in the United States. So I would take issue with Ms. Fisher's claim that it's not an APD problem, it's a community problem. It is a problem in APD, and that makes it our problem. I would also say the problem of violence is a police issue, right? We're not talking about the problem of violence in our communities. That exists, no one has denied it. But the issue is, why are police in Albuquerque killing people at the rate they're killing them? And that's the question. And the answer to my question, why have we never been able to reform it, might have something to do with the fact that there are still people that refuse to honestly and courageously confront that question. That's the key question. It is about mental health services that have been hollowed out. It is about the homeless that are criminalized. It is about the fact that when James Boyd on March 16th laid his head down to go to sleep, like every single person in this room, when he did it, it was a crime and he was killed for it. That's the problem, and I think that we have to courageously confront that, and there are very good police officers who also want to be a part of that, and the DOJ report makes it clear that it is a systemic problem of leadership, of training, of shoot-first mentality. And until we confront this problem first and foremost, we can never get to the question about the hollowing out of mental health services. We can never get to the question about decriminalizing the homeless. That's the key question, and I hope that as we spend the rest of the time on this panel really focusing in on that key issue. Thank you.
Our next question was submitted by Vicente Alvarado. How would you recommend that police respond to calls for service when they encounter a person who is armed with a gun or a knife? And Maria, I would like for you to respond first on this.
I was hoping to take a no answer to that. You know, I'm a sociologist who studies crime, so I would look at it from a systemic kind of model and look at the way you need to make sure that there's a proper training. And what I mean by that is this doesn't happen at all places. So the fact that police violence varies across place and that Albuquerque has such a high rate suggests that there is some things that we can do, that there are other places that do it better in terms of training, right? So I don't have any specific things that we could do because that's not my area of expertise, but rather my area is to look at it that this is not an individual level problem, right? This is a systemic societal problem in which we think about these things at the macro level, and what that means is we look at the organizational features of the department. So I applaud that we need to have better systematic training with our officers and look to other places that do a better job than we do.
Karen Fisher?
Thank you so much, Virginia. I want to be clear that I have never been a police officer. I've never been trained as a police officer. I was a civilian with the Albuquerque Police Department for 25 years. I cannot speak to how and when a police officer makes a decision when confronted with force. However, we are a violent society. We have school shootings every day. We have gun violence. We have people living on our streets in deplorable conditions. And if we find that acceptable, people can be hurt. We, again, as a community, have to respond to things that are larger. And I know that if you point a gun or a knife at a police officer, the reality is your odds of being killed are very high. They have to react very, very quickly, and they're thinking of, they have to react within seconds. I can't second guess what they've done. I just know that I've chose not to be a police officer. Me with a gun, I'd probably hurt myself, which is not a very good thing. So I think we need to, I can't answer that question very directly because I just know what the reaction is when an officer is faced with a gun or a knife.
David?
So I think that in one sense, this is a really troubling question to me because we're on a panel to talk about the problem of police violence in this community. And if the question is, what are police supposed to do if they encounter someone who's armed? The implication is that they're supposed to kill them. And so that's really troubling to me. I think we need to talk about the kind of tactics that have been absent and that the DOJ pointed to specifically. So let me just give one example that I think maybe everyone here is familiar with. In the 4-hour standoff that culminated in James Boyd's violent death, the crisis intervention team was never once called and never came out. Let me just point out that when Christopher Torres was killed by APD, he suffers from mental illness, he had a crisis intervention officer assigned to him, and he was never called out. And so to say that the odds of someone who has a weapon is going to be killed by police is true, I think, more in this community than others. But if the DOJ report is any indication, we do not use the resources to help us non-violently resolve these moments. Right? And in all of these cases, we're talking about people with mental illness. The DOJ report was clear, let me point out, that these were non-threatening situations. People who had weapons but were not threatening them, right, using them threateningly. They were known to have mental illness. They had crisis intervention officers assigned to them. those routes were not chosen. And let's just point out that we were told in the day after James Boyd's killing that crisis intervention officers were there. They were not. So I would agree that it's an important question, but perhaps not important on this panel, which is supposed to be about the question of police violence, right? But if we're going to be forced to answer this, let's focus in on the absolute failure of training APD officers regarding the use of crisis intervention teams, which was explicitly pointed out by DOJ and contributed to a climate of unconstitutional policing and the unjustified use of lethal and non-lethal force.
Caroline.
And my answer would be about the expansion of the use of crisis intervention teams. And so we do have a good model where where officers who self-select and want to learn more about mental health problems, want to learn advanced communication skills, receive training about how to diffuse tense situations. And when crisis intervention team members are involved, they can be very successful at kind of calmly diffusing a situation, helping somebody, directing them to mental health care. And we don't hear about these because they go smoothly. But it's true that I think the CIT teams, there's few officers that are very comfortable in this model. And I think what happens is that when you have a situation and there's a disconnect between what's happening in the street and these CIT teams. So I agree that the answer is really the expansion of this model, which is successful, but probably small.
I just wanted to add that there's sort of two ways to think about this, and that's what I think my job is here, to understand how complicated this issue is, not the specific incidents, but yes, there are situations in which police officers find themselves in a violent situation. We call that the reactive hypothesis or the community violence hypothesis. We know that matters, right? But there are all these other layers that add to the likelihood of police shootings happening. And so that's where the training and the organizational features that can happen. And I respectfully disagree with Karen that we don't live in an age of violence. My undergraduate students know that crime has been declining for the last 20 years at overall major decline. So we're also seeing this violence happening in a context of very little violence, relatively speaking. And also, when we think about policing, right, when we think about policing, we're thinking most policing is day-to-day policing. It's not the kind of policing we're necessarily talking about today. So I think training the officers in crisis intervention sounds like a good investment as well, right? Because that'll help with sort of the everyday kinds of policing that they face on a regular basis.
Yes, I'd like to respond by saying that we do live in a violent community. In Albuquerque alone, we have over 100 different gangs. Not gang members, different gangs. Each gang that could have over 200-300 members in them. We're ranked up there amongst Detroit, Michigan, New York City, and Chicago as having the worst gang problems in the country. We are a violent community. We have drugs on the streets. We have violence on the streets. To think anything less, you're ignoring the problem. And when you get down to police violence, there wouldn't be violence unless there was guns involved by people that are pulling guns out in the community or on other officers. If they weren't pulling guns out, then there wouldn't be any violence. Officers are people, they have families, they have a right to go home at the end of their shift. They have to put on a bulletproof vest every single day and go out there and solve the community's problems. From domestic violence to the drug dealer on the corner to somebody stole my car. We're the biggest babysitters in the country. If people weren't acting badly, the police wouldn't be called. If people were doing
excuse me. I would like
I-
to make sure we maintain a respectful tone here, please.
I don't think a single officer has ever taken a 911 call saying, hey, send an officer down to my house. What's your emergency? Oh, no emergency. I'm just having a great day. I want to share it with them. Officers are sent to situations where people are acting bad. And unfortunately, there are consequences for that. If you don't teach your kids that there's consequences for your actions, then they grow up not thinking there's any consequences. If you pull a gun or a knife on a citizen, there's going to be consequences. If you pull a knife or a gun on an officer, there's going to be consequences. Learn that. If you blame the stove for being at fault for your kid touching it and burning his hand, then you're allowing them to act badly. Teach the kid, don't touch the stove and you won't get burned.
All right, excuse me. We have a respectful campus policy here. Thank you. You'll have an opportunity to ask a question. This is from Karen Fisher.
And I'm sorry, but I'm going to condense your question a little. To move Albuquerque forward and begin to heal this community, all citizens must have a role in making Albuquerque safer. Law enforcement cannot be the sole solution to crime and public safety issues within any community. How can citizens become involved in addressing crime and safety issues and not just rely on police or government to solve complex issues like mental illness and homelessness? And I think we'll start with David on this.
I don't really know how to answer that question because, you know, I've been a part, very proudly to stand with some really courageous people, a lot of families of victims of APD violence. Have been honored to do that. We have organized protests. We have organized community meetings. I have been writing for years on this. And the tenor of that question, I think, is a criticism that somehow our efforts are a targeted criticism of and only of the Albuquerque Police Department. I will say that to directly answer your question, if you're interested, join me, join Ken Ellis, join Mike Gomez, join Renetta Torres, all of the families of APD victims who have been devoting their lives since their children were taken from them to try to do something about this. And I will remind you that their efforts have not been empty criticisms of APD. Their efforts have been about reforming the mental health system in this community, right? Trying to fill the hole that we've hollowed out in those services. They've tried to bring attention to the failure to rely on crisis intervention teams. They have written editorials, they have talked to public officials, they have talked to elected officials, and what they've gotten is criticism for that. And I'm sorry that I'm perhaps a bit emotional about this, but I want to just point out that that this is not an empty criticism of the Albuquerque Police Department. This is a substantive criticism based on evidence and an 18-month investigation by the Department of Justice that found a pattern and practice of unconstitutional policing in a state with a district attorney that will not press charges against any officer and an attorney general that will not hold anyone's feet to the fire. And this is the movement, this is the social movement that can actually do something about that. Join our efforts to do this, and we'll welcome any officer to join us. And we'll remind them that our arguments have always been about mental health services, have always been about decriminalizing homelessness, have always been about recognizing that this is a political problem, a social problem, a policing problem, first and foremost.
Caroline?
I agree. It is a complex problem, and I'm speaking from the mental health perspective. We absolutely need a more robust system, and we don't want to be relying on the police officers and the justice system to be directing people into care. So we know that people with early signs of psychosis, the outcomes are much worse if their first contact with the mental health system is because they've had an altercation with the police and the police gets them to the emergency department in the hospital. Years down the line, that individual is going to have much worse outcomes than if the first contact is in the school with a teacher or a family or a friend who says, I think something's wrong, do you want help, and directs them into care that way. If the entry into care is much more gentle, people have much better health outcomes, they're much more likely to stay engaged in care and get good treatment. There's a huge amount of stigma around mental health in our community and in our country. We don't talk about it, people don't know how to recognize it, don't know how to name it, and don't know how to get people into care. And I think that's part of it. One piece of the solution is addressing stigma in mental health and kind of early intervention for these problems.
As far as the community goes, I'm somebody that I don't want to have to call the police when there's something going on. I don't want to have police interaction. But the thing is, as a community, if you don't want to call the police, that's great. I encourage you not to call the police, but the thing is, if you want to keep your community safe, then get involved. Know who your neighbors are. How many of you here know who your neighbors are? How many of you here know what their problems are, know what situations they're facing? Get involved in your community. Take care of each other. Volunteer at the mental health places and offer your help. How many of you do that? Again, get involved in your community. Know who you're surrounded with. I happen to be one of the first CIT intervention officers that they certified in the department. And sometimes that doesn't work. You have to have community involvement because the police cannot take care of everything. They're not always counselors. It can't be someone to always, say your problems to, or can you help me this? I mean, police have to take on different hats all the time depending on what calls they take. If you don't want to call the police, that's great, but get involved in your community. The thing is, not getting involved in your community and then being upset for what takes place in your community is like somebody who votes and then complains over the elected officials. If you want to say, then vote. Be part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Okay, so I'm a criminologist, right? I've already said that. So we study community. We see the world as an interplay between what the community can do and then what cities can do, right? So I completely agree that what the communities are a fundamental part of the equation to bring about accountability by the mayor's office, police departments, etc. There's mechanisms that can be put into play by the city. So I see it, and criminologists and sociologists see it as an interplay. Cities can make or break neighborhoods through the kinds of resources they provide neighborhoods for community policing, greening up public spaces, etc. And we know, you look around the Albuquerque, we know that those kinds of resources are unequally distributed across places. And so even though we want to say, and I agree that the community does play a role, it's also a function of what the city does and how it helps make or break a neighborhood. And I'll talk more about that when my question comes up.
Thank you, and it's now time for your question, Maria. What can cities do generally, and police departments specifically, to garner the trust and perceived legitimacy of the citizens so that residents can participate in the collective goal of promoting neighborhood safety? And I think I'd like to start with Karen on this one.
Thanks, Virginia. First to start, I want to be clear that my questions and comments, as David seems to have perceived them, are that there's not anything wrong. I think there are many things wrong. My view comes from how do we as a community come together, and that is a response to this question. On the issue that we've already addressed of homelessness and mental illness, there are a lot of people living today on the streets of Albuquerque who are homeless and mentally ill. Who cared about Brenda Sullivan, who lived on the streets of Albuquerque for 20 years and who died at the hands of another individual in a hotel because she was a chronic alcoholic? What about the time we had to get able to get her into treatment, to get her into detox? They wouldn't take her into detox if she hadn't been drinking. We had her dry for a week. We had to buy her vodka so that the judge could smell the alcohol on her breath so we could get her in detox. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that part of the community? What about the individuals living homelessly in our community and with mental illness who freeze every winter at Los Altos Park and underneath the overpasses in this city? Those are our responsibility too. And where were we as a community a week before James Boyd was killed? Where were we talking about those individuals? My comments are the police have a role. They can't be the sole solution to crime and public safety. We have, as a community, need to be part of how we deal with individuals who are living on the margins, who do not have health care. In 1980s, when Ronald Reagan deinstitutionalized the mental health care system, what happened to those people? They cannot avail themselves to mental health services. An officer is called out on a call. They go to the call. If there's a crime, they take the person to jail. They can arrest them. If the person is of danger to self or others, they can take them to UNM Mental Health. The person can be checked in and then immediately check themselves back out and go on the street. If a person is mentally ill and not a danger to self and others, there's nothing an officer can do. They leave them on the streets. Is that the Albuquerque Police Department's question? That's the issue I'm getting at. We as a community need to respond to the needs of people who have less ability. And we can't just sit back and blame when things go wrong. Maybe my questions aren't with police violence. Mine are for people who live in Albuquerque and care about this community. Like I said, I'll die here. And I hope I die in a community that works together towards safety for everybody, whether it's officers or homeless individuals.
I want to remind you all that the question is, what can cities do generally and police departments specifically to garner the trust and perceived legitimacy of its citizens so that residents can participate in the collective goal of promoting neighborhood safety? So let's go to David now.
That's an excellent question, and if you haven't already read the DOJ report, I would encourage you to do so, particularly the way in which the DOJ report suggested real community policing could be an important part of that. So for example, I want to just quote you 2 spots for the DOJ report. This is the 18-month Civil Rights Division investigation by the Department of Justice that found, quote, among APD, the overemphasis on using force, especially weapons, to resolve stressful encounters and insufficient emphasis on de-escalation techniques. Much of the training leads officers to believe that violent outcomes are normal and desirable, unquote. And then I think perhaps even more troubling was the way in which the DOJ report found that in everyday interactions, Albuquerque police officers are too often and routinely rude and aggressive when they encounter the public. Quote, this is the DOJ report saying, quote, officers routinely express hostility toward people not engaged in the commission of any crimes, unquote. So what can Albuquerque, the police department, do to garner our trust and legitimacy? Stop harassing us, stop shooting us, start engaging in honest community policing that doesn't place themselves outside of the fabric of this community as somehow external to it, submit themselves to real binding community oversight, first and foremost. And then that's the start, I think.
Vicente?
I think as far as cities, the cities can provide budgets for training. I'm a huge advocate of training, huge. Without training, then you're sending out people that don't know what they're doing. Every class that I've instructed, every class that I've taught to cadets or police officers, I always end with this. I always tell them, don't let your emotions dictate your actions. When your badge is only this big, when it becomes this big, then you as the officer has a problem. Get involved with your community. Know the people in your beat. Stop by to their house, knock on their door, talk to them, introduce yourself, drop a card. Let them know that you're a human being just like they are. Now the thing is, in regards to the DOJ didn't even have a use of force continuum until about 15 years ago. They don't walk the streets, they don't walk a beat, they don't have public interaction, they don't take calls for service, they don't do any of that. They sit behind a desk and they critique things that they never had any experience in. That's what's based on that report. Officers that go out there every single day and interact with their community, those are the ones that have the experience. And again, in regards to that last comment, stop shooting us, stop harassing us, well, stop pulling guns out, stop pulling weapons out, and be a productive member of society.
Okay. Caroline?
And I agree, training is a huge part of this. Providing training, first of all, around mental health, also communication skills. The other part is the piece about resources that are available, too. So it's important for the APD and for all people working in the system. We have a very fragmented system of care, but knowing what are the available resources in the community with this idea of early intervention before it gets to a crisis. But if somebody's struggling, somebody wanting care, knowing how to direct them to care. And it's not an easy answer, but I think education around this and knowing about communication, what are the mental health issues, what are the risks, and what are the resources available locally?
I just wanted to add really fast when your response of what can cities do and the response that I had given. You know, cities and government can avail themselves to allowing programs for alternatives to traditional responses. That was my whole response on that. What can a city do? And in Albuquerque, they do have a crisis outreach and support team. They do have a psychiatrist that works within the Albuquerque Police Department. They try. It's not a perfect response, but cities can provide funding and programming that allow alternatives to traditional responses.
I'll just say that I think one of the things that the literature on these kinds of issues points to is that you need to have a civilian review board that has some external accountability, that has some teeth. That really distinguishes cities that have high police shootings of civilians versus others. I think that's something we can really do. I think we have to increase our budgets to provide those kinds of training opportunities to deal with, to go from a reactive kind of policing to a proactive, a bottoms-up kind of community approach to policing. And then I think the reason I ask this question very quickly is that when neighborhoods and communities experience a crisis in trust and legitimacy, it sends a spiral of mistrust throughout the community. And what ends up happening, which is not good for the public goal of coming together and having low crime, then people withdraw from society, right? And are less likely to engage in the collective organization against crime. And so that's why I asked that question, because when we have a crisis of trust, which I think we're seeing, right, that is directly related to what's been happening with the police shootings, then that can have an effect on what happens in the community.
So this is the final question from the panel, and then we'll have just a little bit of time, I hope, for audience questions. This is from Caroline Bonham. How do we develop a system of care for people with mental health problems that balances the privacy and autonomy of individuals and families with the need for communication and collaboration across health, social services, and law enforcement agencies? And actually, Karen, I'd like to ask you to respond to this first.
I think my responses have pretty much been in line with Caroline's question so far. I think we do need a system of care within our community which enables people to have means of getting the support they need for their mental illness. I don't know how many of you followed the Heading Home program, and I don't work for the city. I'm not like bowing to anybody down at the city, but R.J. Berry, the current mayor, actually implemented a very innovative program called Heading Home to try to get the most vulnerable individuals off the street and to wrap them around in services so that they would have a means of staying in housing. When you have somebody who's mentally ill and lived on the streets for many, many years, you know, just having walls around you can be very, very frightening. If I was living on the streets, believe me, I would be drunk as a skunk half the time, because the thought of all the bugs and all the things crawling on you, I mean, it will get into your mind. And it will upset somebody who's not living in a healthy environment. You really need to be able to help people get into services, to have outreach between law enforcement and homeless healthcare providers, and we do have that in Albuquerque, where you try to reach people to address the reason they are living homelessly. Why did they leave? Why did they feel like they're unsafe? And I think collaboration and being able to have community response and having a medical system that provides for assistance, you know, provides for support and for their needs for the mentally ill person to be paid for can really help. So I agree completely with everything you've put in the question, Caroline, that it really does need to be a collaboration to be able to address issues of mental illness and homelessness.
David?
Well, I think this is an important question, and I think probably, hopefully, there will be questions in the Q&A about this. There are people here that are a lot more informed and educated on this issue than I am, and so I can only say this. Until we decriminalize homelessness and mental illness by getting rid of ordinances like against transients, against panhandling, we get rid of those ordinances, the homeless and the mental ill will always eventually find themselves in violent conflict with the police. And this is an important point, and it's not to say, it's also to say that the police will also find themselves eventually in violent conflict with the homeless and the mentally ill. So my interest is in focusing on decriminalizing these efforts. And I suspect also that Caroline is pointing to the fact in this question that we have hollowed out these services over the last 15, 20 years. And I think to answer the question finally, how do we develop a system of care? Well, we put care at the center of our politics. I think we have to put care first and foremost at the center of our politics rather than fear.
I agree, there most definitely has to be some type of mental health care increase. You can't depend on officers to respond to a lot of those things and get the outcome that you want. It's just too much for them to handle in that sense. As far as homelessness goes, officers are dispatched to homeless people who are laying out in the streets, who haven't been seen moving around whatsoever. They have to go out there to do what they call a welfare check to make sure that they're still alive and still breathing. Once they can verify they're alive and breathing, then we have units such as the Coast Team that they call out to go down there with vans to pick them up, to take them to shelters, to get them where they need to be, where they're warm, so that they're not out there on the streets. As far as the panhandling ordinances go, those are such a low priority in being dispatched for officers. The officers are too busy taking other calls for service that are of a higher priority. They don't dispatch on panhandlers unless it's a business that's complaining and the business owner knows a commander or a deputy chief and says, hey, I need this guy out of here, what can you do? Then they have to send an officer out there. They don't dispatch on panhandlers. So where those conflicts are coming in, once they get out there to take care of the call, if the homeless individual or someone that they're contacting turns violent, that's when situations have to be escalated or taken care of. But again, the homeless dispatch calls for service are only sent out when they're basically concerned for their well-being, to make sure that they're still alive. And then they get provided the transportation that they need to homeless shelters to make sure that they're taken care of. But again, the panhandling thing, they don't even dispatch on those calls. Those are people that are complaining directly to the police department to handle their problem. That's the only time they get dispatched on.
Okay, Maria? All right, it's time for audience questions. That was the last. Please step to the mic. And please identify yourself and ask your question. And we only have, I'm sorry to say, we only have about 12 minutes, so I hope we'll get to as many as possible.
So my question is not a question, it's more of a statement. My name's Kenneth Ellis. My son was the Iraq war veteran that was shot and killed by APD on January 2010. Let's not kid ourselves, folks. This is not just a local problem, this is a national problem. We have what's called paramilitary training. Take a look at this gentleman. He is paramilitary trained. That's the bottom line. We have a police force that is not policing community policing. They are paramilitary trained to kill, and that's what they're doing. So here we are, folks.
What was your question? Don't worry, I'm an NASCAR, right?
My question has to do with the fact that the trend of 3 bullets seems to be, my husband is a judo guy and into guns, and he said that is a 2 shots to the body and 1 shot to the head practice of our wonderful SWAT team. And I'm wondering if there's anything in the DOJ, as aside, to have somebody representing himself from the APD, even as a retired officer, to question the DOJ results, to me is highly insulting. You are not doing the APD a favor. Right now, the gold standard for all of us in the community is the DOJ report. So anybody in a service or in the force that can't find themselves respecting that and representing themselves to be respecting the Department of Justice is really disturbing. I live in Corrales. We have police officers that risk their lives and go to the hospital with broken backs trying to stop speeding because there's children walking on the street. I'm sure APD has tons of those too. But I don't come from a place where the police just go around trying to hurt people, even though we can be very irritating people. And my question is, and the 1 shot to the head. The girl yesterday may not have been this personality, but she got 3 shots. When 1 shot would suffice. I'm trying to figure out what is the 3 shots.
Okay, the question is regarding the 3 shots, what seems to be a 3-shot rule, and I'm wondering if we could get a very quick response on this, please, from Vicente first.
Officers are not taught a 3-shot rule. They're taught 2 shots to the body, which is a standard training. The 3 shots come in is when those 2 shots aren't effective, then you result to a 3rd one. That's right, 2 shots are not effective. I've been involved in a shooting myself, and 2 shots didn't keep the subject from running, from coming at us. No, we don't shoot people in the kneecaps because they can still shoot us with their hands, and not every officer is that great of a shot.
All right, all right, thank you very much for your question. We have more questions now. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I understand that this is... Next question.
Okay, I guess my voice carries a little bit. So, I guess what I want to say is a recurring trend in today's dialogue is the idea of people being involved in their community. But my question is, where is the police effort to get the community involved in policing? How can we be involved when they perpetuate a civilian review board that is essentially a shell? And where's the effort of the police to get involved in the community more proactively instead of reactionarily?
That was a bunch of really good questions, I think. And I think it might be good, Karen, it looks like you'd like to say something, and I'd like to also hear Maria give us a kind of national context on that as well.
I can answer this question in terms of experience I had when I was working with the Albuquerque Police Department. I cannot speak to what they are doing now, but I can tell you part of what I did was working in engaging the community. Believe it or not, the Albuquerque Police Department approached the homeless service providers to try to be able to engage them in proactive problem solving, which means prevention, partnership, and problem solving. How do we as a community work together to address the problems that impact our community? We implemented something like a homeless outreach. We've also done work with neighborhoods. On a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, yes, the Albuquerque Police Department does have a block watch captain. It does mean asking people to get to know their neighbors. I don't know what's in the DOJ report regarding community policing. I have no idea what the Albuquerque Police Department presented regarding community policing. However, I know the programs that have been implemented during the time I was there, and it was an idea of engaging the community and looking at how we can work together. What is your concern would be my question back. You know, are you concerned about what part of the community? Find a way to become involved with
All right,
as
we
a
need
community
to,
member.
Thank you. And I'd like to hear from Maria on this from a national point of view.
So the question was, what can the police do to encourage community involvement? Well, I mean, the community has to feel they have to have a strong relationship with the police to begin with, and because so many communities feel marginalized from the local police, it's a very difficult process. That's what the research shows us, right? So you have to have bottoms-up policing. What does that mean? You have to have the police, and this is what the research suggests. I'm not saying specifically individual police persons, but they've got to be able to they have to be able to see that the heads up of the police department are requiring that the police officer sees themselves as part of the community, not an us versus them, but it's actually part of the community. It's about recruiting and training police officers so that they see that it's not that the day-to-day policing is not reactionary, but actually community policing. So those are a few things. I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks. Next question, please identify yourself if you would.
My name is Ravi Wadhwani. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I've only lived in Albuquerque for a short time, but I've lived in a lot of different places, including Japan, Brazil, and other places. And I want to say first to the gentleman in the t-shirt, stop lying. When somebody does not have a gun.
Excuse me, we need to have a respectful discussion here. Please try to keep your voice down. Please try to keep your voice down if you wouldn't mind.
I can step away from the mic if that's all right. I am.
Yeah, we're getting feedback.
Stop lying. When somebody does not have a gun, be like the good cops in the APD and say that they didn't have a gun. Don't say they pulled the gun when they didn't have a gun. Though the DOJ was called in because you have lied to us for years. We have been lied to for many, many years, which is why the DOJ was called in, and which is why after an 18-month investigation, they found that you were lying to us. This is why we say stop lying. Our sister was killed yesterday. Our sister here in Albuquerque was killed. Let me make an analogy for you. You have airliners coming at the World Trade Center. Right now, people are being killed in Albuquerque, and what you are doing is talking about the litter on the streets of New York. This is not what you should be discussing right now.
Thank you very much.
You have a very immediate and urgent problem, and Mayor Berry and the city administration is responsible.
Thank you.
And I support the good cops in APD.
Thank you very much.
Hello, yes, my name is Adam Quintana, and this is not a response to the last gentleman's question. It just happens to be somewhat related to his statement.
Can
you hear me now?
Sorry, yeah.
Sorry about that. Okay, my name is Adam Quintana, and it's not a...
Sorry, we're not managing our sound system very well. I apologize.
Alrighty, and again, this is not a statement in regards to his. It just happens to be somewhat relating to. I would say what happened lately is we have something with with everyone that happens to have this happening with someone that they know. We need to not blame anybody. We need to just do everything we can to have it not happen again, because blaming somebody will not help the problem. And I will say this because I have not had anyone killed yet, but I have friends that I do not know anymore, but I have friends on the streets doing drugs and dealing them, past friends, and I'm sure that they will either be taken in or they might be victims in time. So it just give it time. And the only questions I want to say are the two gentlemen. Honestly, I just think that you two are in a bit of a debate, and you're the two extremes. So if we continue on with this forum, you might want to just continue on and not debate to the extremes. I mean, I do find that you're having a consensus once in a while. I do appreciate that. And I think that if anything you can have.
Thank you very much.
And for everybody, can you please stop yelling at them and making statements, because that will not help anything.
Yeah, we do have a comment here.
I think it's really unfortunate that we have to have a debate. Is there a debate about police violence? I don't understand. I will debate. I will debate that point. So thank you for recognizing.
And I'll just say one thing on behalf of the university, which is as much as I would like for everybody to agree about everything, and for, we don't. And we don't because we have a crisis of trust and authority right now, and a crisis of legitimacy. And that's why there's so many of you here. We've had a report from the Department of Justice. We've had responses from a variety of people. Everyone on this panel came here voluntarily. No one is being paid to be here. Everybody is a part of a public discussion that is a contentious and difficult discussion because lives are at stake. So I take this very, very, very seriously. And I just want to say, while we're still listening, everybody's still listening, I am really grateful to all of these panelists. They had nothing to gain from being out here. Nobody had a thing to gain from engaging in this kind of a free and open debate and discussion. That's what universities are for. So thank you to all of you, and I think we can take one more question, I'm sorry to say.
Hi, my name is Steve Pallon, and I think there are two aspects to this problem. One is the mental health issue, and clearly the mental health facilities are inadequate for the problem that we face. And I'm sure everyone will support paying higher taxes to provide homeless shelters and better mental health for the population. But I don't want to lose the focus on police accountability. And if the police have a difficult job, they're dealing with mentally ill people and violent people, and they never know when they're going to be facing violent episodes or situations. But I wonder if the police and the police union would support having lapel cameras that can't be turned off at will, that as soon as they get turned on, they stay on indefinitely, and that all the officers are equipped with those. Because my understanding now is that the lapel cameras can be turned off at the discretion of the police officer. And the only reason we really found out about the James Boyd, or the reality of the James Boyd shooting, was because of the lapel camera video. I was wondering if the police union and the police officers would agree to have those lapel cameras that can't be turned off.
Actually, the police department already has those. They're the taser cameras that fit on top of the shoulder, and those record all the time. Anytime that they have them on, they record 30 seconds prior. They hold 30 seconds prior before they turn on, and I don't know how they do it, but it's 30 seconds prior, and once the camera is so-called turned off, it records another 30 seconds prior to that as well, and they're mandated to have those things on all the time. From their shift, they have to download every citizen contact that the officer has. They have to go back to their car and download it and tag that contact into evidence. So they already exist. They're already here.
If they do exist, and the DOJ report does point out that there was a disturbing pattern of officers not activating their cameras. So if there are videos of every single police shooting, then why haven't we seen them? We've requested, I myself have made requests through the IPRA law to see those. I have not seen those. A number of community organizations have made requests. We have not seen those. None of them have been released. I myself, in a meeting with the New Mexico Attorney General Gary King, asked him why he has not voiced an opinion about that. He said he would. He's still silent. So I agree that that's an important thing, but it doesn't matter if we actually have those videos if APD won't release them. And the truth is that they won't. They'd rather pay the fine in the IPRA law than release those videos.
Now, on that, they won't release the videos because they're part of evidence. When you release those videos to the general public, it taints the case, and the people that are being held accountable can't get a fair trial. Evidence has to be protected until the case has been adjudicated. You can't release that stuff to the public because it taints the case and the case will go nowhere. That's why they can't release those. The ones that they have, those cases are tainted. They won't get a conviction anywhere in court because those videos have been released to the general public and the case is tainted. It's not going to go anywhere.
I wish that we had more time just on this question alone, let alone all of the questions that you're all waiting to ask, all of the questions that have already been asked. There will be, I understand, another forum at 5:30 Friday night at the Peace and Justice Center. People are welcome to go to that. This conversation will continue in public venues all over the city. UNM, as a community engaged institution, has had an obligation to try to bring you all together. I thank you very much for a very respectful gathering. Thank you very much to all of the participants. Thank you a lot.